Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Brittany Dufilly. I'm the Educational Outreach Coordinator here at Verteks. Today, we've got Steve Hall, one of our senior engineers who is going on his 20th year here at Verteks, and he's going to be presenting our Connect directory training for you guys. Thank you. Go ahead, Steve. It's all yours.
Hello, thank you, Brittany. Good afternoon, everyone. As Brittany said, we're going to do a Connect overview and drill into a few commonly asked about features. All right, so this is the Mitel Connect director. As many of you already know, when you first log in, the first thing it does is it brings you to this maintenance dashboard screen. Kind of shows you what's going on with the system right now. There's really only a couple things on here that I would typically look at. Call volume, that's going to be whatever the call volume is. That doesn't really change a whole lot from what your normal is. But the couple things I do look at on here would be bandwidth utilization if you're in a multi-site system. If you see the bandwidth utilization between your sites getting up into the yellow or even the red area there, then you might have something to look at. This bandwidth utilization, what it's actually looking at, it doesn't necessarily know how much bandwidth you have connecting between, your two sites, whether you have a VPN or a point-to-point, fiber or whatever you've got. But there's a setting under the sites in Connect Director where we tell it how much bandwidth we want to use for phone calls. And so maybe we told that, you've got, 1 meg of bandwidth between these sites for phone calls. And if the number of phone calls you're sending across that link gets close to that, that's when you're going to see this bandwidth utilization chart move up into the yellow or red. And then eventually, if you try to push more calls over that site-to-site connection than the bandwidth you have configured, it'll actually deny that user from being able to make that call. And you'll get an error message in the system log that we can take a look at. And maybe it's just a matter of we need to change the setting on the site to a higher bandwidth, or maybe we need to increase the bandwidth between the sites, or even change the voice codec that we're using to send calls across the site-to-site link, so that we can squeeze more calls into that link if that's what we need to do. Although the calls don't use a ton of bandwidth, so usually that's not an issue these days. The next thing on this dashboard overview I tend to look at is the trunk group usage. Again, you want to watch and make sure that none of your trunk groups are getting up into the yellow or red area. This is going to show you a percentage of trunks that are in use in that particular trunk group. So in this case, you can see the purple line on our chart indicates our PRI. Our PRI has 23 channels, and so that's what it's basing that percentage of calls based on. And again, you want to keep an eye on that, because if that starts to get, if that gets maxed out, you're going to get busy signals either on external calls trying to call in, if all your trunks are in use, or users not able to place outbound calls, again, if all the trunks are in use. The other thing I tend to look at on this screen is the highest average CPU usage, and that just keeps an eye on all the different components that make up your Mitel system, the servers and switches, and lets you know if any of those are working exceptionally hard, and there might be an issue there. We need to rebalance, how things are distributed across your system to bring that back into line, or maybe add some capacity to your system. We do get a lot of questions about the call quality chart up here. I really don't tend to give that a whole lot of credence, because I'd much rather actually get reports from the users if they're thinking they're having a call quality issue. I have seen this generate some, sometimes you'll see these scores down here in the lower in the 1s and 2s of this MOS score, the mean opinion score, which is what it basically believes that call would be rated at. I've sometimes seen it rate a call down here, and when I drill into it, what I find out quite often is that a user picked up the phone, dialed a number, and as soon as it started to connect, they realized they misdialed or some other reason they had to run, and they hung up the call kind of as it was connecting, and that'll generate a low quality call. So sometimes if you just see a little bit of that, I wouldn't worry about it too much. If you do see a trend line that stays down in the low area, then we might need to look at what's going on, again, with network utilization, network errors, things like that that could be causing that call quality to be impacted. Another thing that I noticed when I first log into a Mitel Connect director is you have these alert status indicators across the very top that kind of let you know if anything is going on in the system. And these are generally, an alert gets triggered by some event in the system. A switch has a problem, you've exceeded all your trunks, something like that, and it'll turn one of these red. If I go to this appliances here that shows that it's red to see what's going on, what I can see back here is, in this case, earlier today at about 10 o'clock in the morning, there was a problem with this switch called Mitel MyVCR. It lost connection to the network. I happen to know what that was about. There was some maintenance going on, so I know I can disregard that. And so what I'm going to want to do to clear that error message out is I can check off the error as it is, or if there's several, I can check up here to kind of group select. And then I can select the option to clear this. And kind of, you have to navigate to another page before you see any effect of that. But now I can see that all my status alert indicators here at the top are all green. And I've gone and I've taken a look at what caused it to go red and kind of cleared that up. So that's kind of the first couple things I look at when I log into the Connect director. Next thing I like to look at, especially if it's a large multi-site system, is this connectivity grid. The connectivity grid shows all the major components of your Mitel system, your servers, the voice switches, lists them all out here. And then it shows you with this kind of two-way communication grid, what other devices it can talk to. So I can see here, again, we've got this Mitel MyVCR. As I said, there's some maintenance being done on that. And so what you see here is what you would get if a device is basically offline. All the way across on line 8 here, we've got question marks saying it doesn't know what the status of it is. And then the vertical line here with the red X's, what it's telling me is that, you know, on this particular line, the V trunk switch on line number 3 cannot talk to the device on line number 8. And if we look over here on line number 8, that's that Mitel MyVCR switch again. So it's just saying that this trunk switch can't talk to it, this phone switch can't talk to it, this VSA can't talk to it, and so on. The connectivity grid really comes in handy when you're in a multi-site scenario, and you may have routing issues where you might be able to see that there's routing issues by seeing that devices at site A can talk to devices at site B, and devices at site A can talk to devices at site C, but maybe devices at B and C can't see each other. So maybe there's a route between B and C that's not working properly, and this connectivity grid is a great way to see that, and can really help you zero in on where in the network we need to look to get that resolved. Next thing I like to look at when I log into a Connect system, and I just want to make sure everything is working properly, is I'll open up the status and maintenance and come down to my list of appliances. So again, similar to the last screen we were on, except this is showing me more details about each specific appliance. I'm going to go ahead and select our T1K switch here, and then I'm going to look at the status tab over here. What I can see here by looking at the status tab is some things that I like to look at are the last boot time. So this switch has been up since February 4th at 7:33 a.m. So if I'm thinking that maybe something rebooted and I want to know when, where, or why, I can see when the last time that happened. The last time it connected to the system. Now you see the boot time is back on 2.4, the connect time is on 2.15. That can be caused because the device didn't necessarily reboot, but at that time at 2.15, on 2.15 at 6 a.m., it lost communication with its controlling server, or in this case, our headquarters server for this system, and it regained connection at 6:11. So that could have been that the server rebooted, or it could have been a network issue. Several things could have caused that. But that's definitely good information if you're trying to troubleshoot something, because if that happened about the time that you're getting reports of a problem, then that gives you a direction to look at. Because this is a T1K switch, which means it connects to our PRI telephone service, I get some specific information about the condition of my PRI connection. My D channel is good, coding, framing, all that's good. internal equipment and the hardware, typically that's always going to be good. And then I can even see which channels of my PRI are in use. We don't have a ton going on today on that PRI, as you can see. But I do like to look in here. Some things you'll see, just at a glance, you'll see that, again, we've got a device in red. We know it's a device that's down for maintenance, so nothing to be worried about there. The status is unknown, so that's what you're going to see when a device is unplugged or the network to it is down. Very commonly, you'll see a device in here that's yellow, so not green, not red, but yellow. So that means it's online and communicating, but there are some sort of problem with it. What I typically see with something that shows up as yellow is it's going to be a phone switch, and it's going to be telling you under the usage that some IP phones are unplugged. So that will cause a switch to show yellow in the screen if you've got some phones out there that were once plugged in and then got removed or unplugged. Could be somebody rearranging offices. Could be that you had a phone go bad and you unplugged the old phone, plugged in a new phone, and kind of never went back through the list of phones and deleted the old broken phone from the system. So it now sees it as an offline phone, and gives you a yellow indicator there. And then the other thing I see that often causes a switch to show the yellow status would be firmware mismatch. If you get a brand new switch or a replacement voice switch, or you're in the middle of doing a system upgrade, which is typically something we're going to help you with, you will see that the switches are going to be on different firmware versions from each other, and it's going to indicate that here that you've got a switch that has a firmware version mismatch, and it's going to show up as yellow. And typically with a voice switch, all we have to do is come over here and select that voice switch, give it the command to reboot, send that command to it. When the switch reboots, it'll contact the controlling server for that switch and download the correct firmware and get itself sorted out. But this screen is definitely the first screen I typically drill into if I'm getting reports that something is down. People can't make phone calls, phones aren't working, that sort of thing. Servers is also a very good one. The servers control things kind of a little bit higher up the application tree. So the switches control your trunks and your phones. The servers control things relating to site-to-site communication, your application. So like the Desktop Connect application talks to the servers, work groups, contact center, those sort of things, all run on the servers. So if you're having issues with that, we can come into the servers and we can see if they're communicating properly. And then we can even see down here the actual services that this server is running and make sure that they all show running as they should. So depending on what's going on, that may be where I go to look. IP phones is another one that's handy to look at. Now, we do know, again, because we're doing some maintenance, that we've got some phones that are showing a firmware version mismatch. I discussed that about the switches. You can also have a firmware mismatch on phones. Again, you can update the phones very easily by selecting them here and selecting to update their firmware and sending that command to the phone. I like to look here if I'm getting reports of phones are down, people are telling me their phones aren't working. What I'll do is I'll quickly come in here and I'll look and see, is it just the one or two phones that I've been told about, or is it all the phones at a particular site in a particular building? Maybe there's some network issue, and this would be a good way to see that. Again, when you are looking at a big long list of most things in the Connect director, there's a couple of navigation aids here that can help you out. So first of all, at the very top, you can sort by most of these columns. So if I want to see all the phones at a particular site, I can click on the site column and sort that. Our system only has the one site, so pretty easy. Or if I want to get a little bit more detailed, I can click this magnifying glass and I can open up these search fields at the top of each list. And so here I can get a little bit more granular where I can say, I want to see all the extensions that start with a 2. We don't have any in this system, or maybe a 1-1. Thought we had that. Nope. We got a lot of 14s, we got a lot of 18s, so I can zero in on just the 1800 switch, 1800 extensions if I want to, and see if those are all up. Or again, if you're looking at a particular site, you can clear that out, come over here and type in the site and see all the phones at a particular site. So those navigation aids are very handy. Again, another couple of navigation aids are over here on the far right-hand side of the screen. I have an option here in the middle to expand the details pane, and at the top there's a corresponding button to expand the list pane. So the screen we're looking at is broken up into a list of things at the top, and then below it are the details of that particular item we have selected at the top. In this case, it's showing me all the phone calls that this phone has been involved with. If I click up here to expand the list, I can get a better view of the list of all the different telephones in my system. If I click that again, I'll go back to the split screen. And then if I click this one down here to expand the details, I can get a better look at the details for that one item I have selected at the top. So it just helps you make use of your screen space there. Let's see. Next thing down the list here that is very handy to look at is voicemail usage. I like to look at voicemail usage for a couple of reasons. One, it can, in some cases, in a big enough system, get to an issue where it consumes enough drive space to be of concern. So you might want to take a look at it in that respect. Also, I like to look at it because a lot of times, if a system is not configured properly, or if your callers are trying to find extensions, you might end up seeing an extension in here that's incorrectly configured with a voicemail box, and your callers are finding it and leaving voicemails there, and no one's checking them. So I like to come in here and take a look at my list of voicemail boxes, and what I typically look for is where the number of unheard messages matches the total number of messages, and it's a rather high number. That usually tells me that I have a mailbox out there that's not being checked. And that's something I want to drill into and take a look at, either why calls are getting there or why that mailbox is not being addressed. And then the other item in here that's real handy, there's kind of two, events and event filters, and I'll talk about together. So most things that happen in the Mitel system do get logged as an event, and you'll see this in here. You'll also see this in the Windows event viewer. So the system actually writes an event to the Windows event viewer, so you can go take a look at it using the Windows event viewer tool, or you can come in here to Director and see those same events in here. And so yeah, every time a switch reboots or a phone reconnects, different things happen. Some of the other things we talked about bandwidth being exceeded for a site-to-site connection, or trunk groups being exceeded, it's going to write an event in here, and we'll be able to see when that happened, what user tried to place the call, if they were denied a call because of bandwidth or trunk related issues. Those will be in the description and details of the message. Related to events are the event filters. So with the event filters, we know that there are some events that we'd like to know about. We'd like to know every time someone's call gets denied because there's no trunks available, right? We can set up an event filter for that. Once we know the particular event ID that's triggered when that happens, and then we can send that to an email address here. So there's a pretty extensive list of events that the system generates. Those can all be found in the Mitel Connect maintenance guide, which is available in the documentation. There's a documentation link here in Director up here at the top left. I also have a list. If you're interested, you can reach out to me directly. I can provide you kind of what I've put together is the highlights or the most commonly monitored events that you might want to get an email about. Things like your PRI is down or your trunks go down. Call gets denied because there are no trunks or because of bandwidth, or maybe a server goes down. Those sort of things. I have a list of, say, about 10 different events, most of which are represented here on the screen, that we recommend setting up on your system. There are some specifically related to the contact center. If you have that component as part of your Mitel system, there's some specific events you'll want to look at related to events that happen in the contact center and get alerted when those happen. And so that's how you can set up the system to kind of proactively notify you and hopefully find out about those things instead of getting called on your phone. So that is the maintenance section there. Couple other things just to kind of show you the navigation here across the top before we get to the user section. There's a diagnostics page here. There's a couple things in here, packet captures and trunk test. So with the trunk test, you can see all the trunks that compose your Mitel system. You can actually use this to simulate an outbound call using these trunks to make sure that they're working, or you can just see, you know, who's on a call using this screen, so it can be handy for that. And then packet captures, some of the Mitel devices actually have the ability to perform a packet capture while you're making a test call if you need to take a little bit further look as to why something is or isn't happening the way you'd expect it to. Sometimes the packet capture is you know, where we need to go with the troubleshooting process, and they make it pretty easy to get those packet captures here in the Connect director, like I said, through some of the devices that can do that for us. And then moving back to the left across the top, as I mentioned, there's the documentation. This is essentially a link that takes you out to the Mitel website where you can find all the different documentation on administration, on how to use the phones, how to use the client. Pretty much all the published documentation on the Mitel Connect system can be found there. Moving over, we've got reports. We're not going to get into that today, but you can run some reports if you want to see all the calls that are placed or received from a particular extension or group of extensions. Or if you're using workgroup features, there's some additional reports that can be run against that. Or if you just want to see, you know, if you do see those, again, those trunks being utilized heavier than you would think, you can run some reports looking back in time to see what was going on during that particular time frame to see why those trunks were all in use. There's some system-wide things under this gear icon. Really the two things that might bring you here would be A, if you need to look at your licenses or add license keys. So I can see in here the license keys that make up our system and tells us, you know, how many soft phones and extension licenses and whatnot. Every time you add capacity to your system, you get another key. The license requirements here will total those up for you, and we can see, you know, how many licenses we have and how many we're using in our system. And then the other thing that might bring you to this gear icon for system settings is administrative permissions. So you've got certain people who can log into Director, and this is where you can set those permissions or remove those permissions if you need to. All right, the next thing I'd like to do is take a little bit of a deep dive into user configuration and some things that we get commonly asked about, or you know, sometimes can present some challenges here. So anything in your phone system that involves actually affecting changes with your phones, with your trunks, with your call routing, it's all done under the wrench for administration. I'm going to drill down into users and select a user here. Got user Brian we're going to take a look at. Again, using this expand details button, I'm going to click this so that it collapses the list and lets me see more details about Brian's extension here. As we navigate down through, the first thing you'll notice is that our system has Active Directory integration enabled, and we have it turned on for this user. So it does have to be enabled system-wide, and then once it's enabled system-wide, we can choose which users we turn it on for. If Active Directory integration is enabled, what that means is essentially the user using the desktop client software, Mitel Connect, has single sign-on for that software, so that it will automatically log them on with whatever user credentials they are logged on to the computer as. So when this domain user, Verteks /B Picard, signs on to his computer and opens up the Mitel Connect application, it will just log him in as user B Picard. If you're not using Active Directory integration, then when a user opens up the desktop software, they're going to need to know their client username And then all the way down here, they're going to need to know their client password to log into that software and get that software to work for them and to be tied to their correct extension. Now the software will remember that, so that's only the first time you log on to that computer. You have to put in the username and the password, but that's what you'd have to do if you're not using Active Directory integration. In this case, we are using Active Directory integration. We often get asked about these two buttons out here, Show from AD and Sync from AD. So we don't need to use either of these buttons to do what I've talked about with the single sign-on. And in most cases, most of the time we don't do anything with those buttons. We don't worry about it. We come in here and we check this off. We put in the user's domain and Active Directory username, and we're done. They've got single sign-on enabled. That works. What this enables, and I need to pull up another window here for you, just because in this case I am signed on as a domain admin to this browser. And I'm going to go take a look. In this case, I'm going to go take a look at a user, Scott, because I know he's got some details in here that don't match. So if I'm looking at this user, again, I'm going to expand the details here. I can select Show from AD, and it is going to show me what the ShoreTel or Mitel system here has for this user. What's their first name? What's their last name? Do we have a home phone, a work phone, a mobile phone, fax pager, email address? Do we have any of those details stored in the Mitel system? And or it's showing us, do we have those values stored in our Active Directory? So in your Windows 80 users and computers, you can populate that with the users, maybe home phone, mobile phone, fax number, whatever. And so this is what this screen is showing. The Show from AD is showing what the ShoreTel or Mitel system has versus what Active Directory has. And to show you kind of the application of that, let me come over here to my other browser, and I'm going to pull up the system directory, and I'm going to look again at our user Scott. And I can see here, if I look at all the details of him in the system directory, we have a DID number for him. We have a cell phone. We don't have a fax number or pager number, if anybody still has a pager. We don't have any of those details showing up in the Mitel system, which means these phone numbers are not available to users of the Mitel Connect desktop application if they want to call his home phone or his fax or whatever. So going back to my other browser, just because this one has the correct permissions, if I want to bring over this pager number and this work phone number, I can select Sync from AD. So the information has been copied from AD. So it only pulls from AD. It doesn't push anything from Mitel to your Active Directory. So it's only a one-way, and it's from Active Directory to Mitel. Now that I've done that sync, I can save this. And now if I go back and look at our system directory record for Scott and refresh the page, I can see now we do show a work phone number for him and a pager number for him because it has pulled that information from Active Directory. And so that, going back to our user page, that is the show and sync from AD and what that does for us. Moving down, because this user is Active Directory enabled and integrated, a lot of these things are grayed out. First name, last name, email address, client username, all these things are grayed out. If you're not syncing from AD and you need to make a change to any of these, the only way to do it is to uncheck this. I will give you a warning that this field is going to go blank when you save it, so you might want to make a copy of what that was so you don't lose it. When you save it, it'll then open these up and you can come in here and make a change. Maybe this last name changed, or you need to make a change here to the email address or something like that. And then once you have that change, save it again and come back up here and Active Directory enable this user so that they've got that single sign-on feature working again. As we move down, a couple things. Include in the system dial by name directory. That is just what it sounds like. When you call into the system and your call is answered by an auto attendant, Sometimes the auto attendant is configured to give the callers an option to search the name directory, and it'll ask them to enter the first few digits of the person's first name or last name. Do you want this extension to be included in the potential results that callers get when they search your name directory that way? Make extension private. This one will not only exclude it from it'll exclude it from the Connect directory, so your other users, when they're pulling up the directory, will not see this extension, but it will also cause their caller ID to be blocked when they make outbound calls, especially if you're on a type of phone line or trunk that allows you to control caller ID. It's going to send a flag that the caller ID is blocked, which, you know, maybe that's what they want to do, but a lot of times people don't take calls from you know, callers who block their caller ID. So that can be something to be aware of with that option there. The DID setting here do we want to give this user a DID or a direct inward dial number for their extension that people can call from the outside? So in this case, we do have this user enabled for a DID, and we can see here if we want to add this or change this. When you hit the drop down, you'll see a list of all the different DID ranges that are available and how many phone numbers are available in those different ranges. And then once you select the range, you fill in the exact number from that range that you'd like to have applied for this user, and now they have a DID. So if you call that number from the outside, it'll reach them. A little bit further down, the next option is PSTN failover. We do get asked about this one a bit. This again applies in your multi-site systems. Let's say you've got two sites and both sites have their own trunks. They both got maybe a PRI or some SIP trunks at each of these sites. With PSTN failover, what can happen is if your WAN link between the two sites were to fail, and a user over here at site A picks up his phone and dials the extension of a user over at site B, because the WAN's down, it's not going to be able to reach it as a voice over IP call. In that case, it can do what's called PSTN failover, where it can, in this case, it could dial that user's DID. So this is the destination user. Let's say I'm the user. I pick up my phone and I dial extension 1456. I can't reach him as a VoIP call. It'll then call, it'll automatically know to call his DID, which is this 482.1456. So it'll go out the trunks that I have at my location and in on the trunks that he has at his location, and it'll reach him. And as a user, I may not have any idea that this is happening, but I still end up getting the call placed that I wanted to place, and I reached the person I wanted to reach. You can also set this to an external number, so I can just put whatever number I want. So maybe that user doesn't have a DID, and so that doesn't make sense to use. You could potentially even set this to be like the front desk at the site that this user's at. So at least if your WAN goes down and I try to call this user over at that other site, it may not reach his desk, but it would at least reach the site, and then maybe the receptionist at that site could then transfer the call to the extension I'm trying to reach, and I'd still have a way to get to them. So that's what the PSTN failover is. It routes your calls instead of via the WAN, it routes them over the PSTN or the public switched telephone network. Next thing we have here is caller ID. Real simple. If you have trunks that allow you to overwrite and send your own caller ID, you can choose what you want to be sent when this person picks up their phone and calls out to the outside world. In this case, we're sending our main business telephone number. You might want to send that user's DID. You might want to send a department number or a site number where that user works. That's your choice there, and that's where you can set that on a per user basis. License type as we move down here, this one's real simple. This is an extension and mailbox. So they get extension for their telephone and they have voicemail box. Extension only, you would probably use on like a fax machine or a break room phone, something like that. They get a telephone extension but no voicemail box. And then mailbox only, rarely used. There's some other features, entities in the Mitel system that we typically use for mailboxes. but you can have an extension listed here, a user extension, that just has a mailbox and no associated telephone extension license. They still have a 4-digit extension number to reach that mailbox, obviously, but that extension is not tied to a phone if they have a mailbox-only license. Next thing we have here is user groups. So under user groups, we have a drop-down list here to look at the user groups that have been created in the system. I'm not going to go too far in depth with user groups. We have covered that in some previous webinars, but just to show you the user groups that we have here, we have a user group here. We got a couple here like VCI users, and a user group is made up of 3 different sets of class of service feature sets. So the first one here is class of service telephony, and this dictates what features can they do on their phone. Can they do things like soft phone, and can they do transferring and forwarding their calls to external numbers, and can they program their phone buttons? Kind of what can they do with their phone is what the telephony class of service permissions provide. The next class of service here is call permissions. This is who can they call. Can they call only internal calls? Can they make local calls, long distance calls, international calls, and so on? The last one is your class of service for voicemail. Do we want to restrict this user to only have a small mailbox, or do we want to allow them to have a large mailbox? And so once you kind of choose a class of service for each of these different types of permissions, you put those all together underneath a user group, and then you apply that user group to your user to dictate what features he has available, who he can call, and some settings related to his mailbox. The next setting, site, actually ties into the next, well, they kind of skip, language. If your system, we don't have too many systems that are enabled for multiple languages. If you did have that applied to your system, you'd have a choice there to change the prompts on the phone. But in this case, the site, and we only have one site in our system, ties into this primary phone port and what phone we have applied. So we've got our user built. Now we need to give them a device to actually make phone calls with. In this case, this is the MAC address of the IP phone that we've given here to this user, Brian. If we want to change that, there's an option to click here to change settings, and we can hit a drop down here, and we can see all the MAC addresses that are available in our system. These are the MAC addresses of phones that have been plugged in but have not been assigned to anyone else. So it's not going to show you all the phones in the system, because it's not going to allow you to take a phone for Brian that's currently assigned to somebody else. If you are rearranging phones, you'd have to unassign a phone from somebody before it would be available to give to Brian, if that's what you were trying to do. But in this case, we choose what MAC address, and we've given him an IP phone. The other thing we could do here, we don't have any of those options available, but the port option here, which I don't have available, so I can't click on it and kind of show you what's there. That would be if you had an analog device that you wanted to connect to your phone system, and you were connecting it to one of the analog ports on the Mitel switches. Some of the Mitel switches provide a certain number of analog ports. Some of them it's 2, 4. There's also ones that provide 24 and 48 analog ports. So if this was, again, like a fax extension or a break room phone that was not an IP phone, you could select port, and you could select the switch and exactly which port on that switch you wanted to tie to this extension, and then you'd have dial tone on that port, again, tied to this extension. Here we can see current port. So this does match the port that we have assigned. So the IP phone that we have assigned to him, this MAC address, also shows here under the current port. If you allow your users to log into other telephones, sometimes you'll see that the current port is different than the one that they were assigned, and this will be lit up here to go to primary phone, and you can send them back to their primary phone. The other thing that you might see under primary phone port, instead of saying IP phone or a specific port, you might see it say soft phone if the user has soft phone enabled, or you might see it say SIP, and there'll be a very long kind of serial number here which is that kind of registration ID for that SIP extension. So if you wanted to tie in like a third-party SIP device to your phone system, such as a conference phone, there's like a Polycom and Comptel's another brand of third-party SIP devices that we commonly tie to the Mitel system. Analog SIP analog adapters, you know, Cisco makes them, Grandstream makes them, third-party devices that can essentially log into your system as a user and then provide an analog port on the other side of that device to plug in, again, like a fax machine or a door phone or something like that. Those would be integrated as a SIP device. To tie a SIP device to your system, you need a couple pieces of information to make that work. First thing, obviously, you need to know the extension number. That's essentially going to be the username that we're going to use on that SIP device to get it to log into the system. The other thing we need to know and set here is the SIP phone password. So this is different than the client password. Sometimes those get mixed up. The client password is just for the software client on the desktop. The SIP phone password is only if you're trying to register a third party, not a Mitel or ShoreTel branded phone, but a third party SIP device to this user extension. You're going to set the SIP phone password down here. And once you have that SIP phone password set, we're going to be able to go into that SIP device, which more than likely has a web interface. We need to plug that into the network, find out what IP address it is, log into that device via the web interface, and key in the extension number, which will be the username kind of for that SIP extension, and the SIP phone password. And then the other thing it's going to ask us for is the IP address for the SIP registration. That's going to tie back to one of our switches. So again, under appliances and platform equipment, we need to make sure that we have a switch in our system. In this case, on our system, we would use our virtual phone switch here. If I look at the switch details tab here, I can see that this device has built-in SIP proxy ports of 5,000. So I probably have room to add this device here because it doesn't show what we're using here, but we're definitely not using 5,000. But you do need to know, and this is the IP address, 10.0, in our case, 10.0.60.13, that we would use when we're configuring that third-party SIP device. That's the third piece of information that we would need: the extension number, the SIP phone password, and the IP address of the Mitel switch that we're going to use for it to register to. And it has to be a switch that both has a SIP proxy capacity and under our site is configured as our proxy switch. Right here under and the vPhone switch, which is the one we were looking at, is our proxy switch. So it's going to accept the registration from that device and allow it to be added to the system. And then again, under users, what will happen when you create the user is when that SIP device logs in, you'll see the primary phone port just change to indicate that it's a SIP device there instead of an IP phone. And that'll get that IP that SIP phone logged in. You'll be able to see that under the current primary phone port that it's assigned to. Let's see, let me expand this again. Another thing that I do like to point out here is to show references. This is a very handy button. What this does is this shows me all the different places in the system where this particular user is being used. So I can see that he is a member of this hunt group. So if I want to get rid of that hunt group or get rid of this user, I need to go and take a look at this hunt group and see if if I've got some other users in there to be able to take that call. I can see that it's the call forwarding destination for some different entities. So if I were to modify this user or reuse this extension for something else, I do need to be aware of that and take that into account. I can also see that several users have programmed buttons to monitor this extension. So this is very handy. Again, if you're trying to either rename, reuse an extension, you're going to want to see all the things that are pointing at it. Or if you go to delete an extension that says you can't delete it because it's in use, the show references is an easy way to see all the things that are tied to that extension that are preventing you from deleting it. which is a nice feature of the Mitel system, that it won't let you delete something if it has other things routed to it until you clean up the routes that get there. And we did talk about, in this case, this user is a member of a couple different hunt groups. I did briefly want to touch on hunt groups versus work groups. We get some questions about that. Two different types of groups in the system that can be used to send a call to multiple people. The difference is that hunt groups are definitely the simpler, more basic version of the two types of groups, hunt groups versus work groups. Hunt groups are good for, kind of more casual type groups, where it's just you want to send the call in, ring a bunch of phones, let somebody grab it. You're not really concerned with who grabbed it or running reports or trying to make sure that there's an equitable or fair distribution of those calls to those users. It can also be handy if you have like a must answer line, like you've got, maybe it's a door phone at your back door and they push that button and it rings a hunt group because, even if this person is away to the bathroom or this person is out to lunch, you want to ring multiple phones and make sure it gets answered right away because you've got somebody standing there waiting. That's another good use for a hunt group. Work groups, on the other hand, have some more advanced, what are called ACD, automatic call distribution capabilities. In addition to just ringing all the phones simultaneously, or a top-down distribution, which we see here on the hunt group, a work group gives us a couple more options where we can do, again, top-down simultaneous. We can also do round robin or longest idle. Round robin is seen as a little bit more fair because it'll send a call to user 1, and then the next call will go to user 2, the next call will go to user 3, whereas top-down, every time we send a call to this group, it's going to start with user 1, and the next call is going to also start with user 1. And so user 1 is going to get basically all the calls unless they don't take it. With work groups, we can also do things like actual call queuing. So we bring a call in, and again, that's going to make more sense with your round robin or more than likely longest idle distribution. And that's going to be useful when you have maybe a team of users whose primary job is to answer calls for this queue. With the work groups, they have the ability, if you want to enable that ability, for them to log in and log out so they can control when they're eligible to take calls for this group or not. Where with a hunt group, you're always in that hunt group. And when a call comes into that work group, if all the agents are tied up on other calls, it can queue that call. So once we go into the call queuing, then we can do things like we can play a message here. We can record and play a message for this call while they're waiting. We can give them even some options while they're waiting. We can say, all of our agents are tied up on other calls. If you'd like to leave us a message, press 1, and we can transfer this out to a mailbox if we want to. So work groups are definitely more feature rich than the hunt groups and have a lot more options. They can also have a mailbox tied to them, which can be handy if you have a team of people who are responsible for checking a shared mailbox. A work group can be a good use for that. A couple other things that might help you with the decision process between hunt groups and work groups would be knowing kind of where those live on the system. So a work group lives on one of your servers, either your Windows servers or Linux DVS servers, and that's what controls and manages that work group. The hunt groups are managed by switches, the SG switches or ST switches or virtual switches is where the work groups live. So when you're designing your system for resiliency, you're going to want to know where those live. And there's also some issues about capacity with hunt groups, especially living on the switches. If you have the old SG switches, you can only have 16 hunt group members across that entire switch. So that's going to limit, how much you're going to want to use hunt groups if you're using SG switches. If you have the new model of ST switches or virtual switches, those capacities go up. It's 24 members of hunt groups on ST switches. And if you're using virtual switches, that's a little bit of a gray area because it depends on how many resources, cores, and memory you give to the virtual switch. But it can be, much higher, 3, 4, 5 times as many hunt group members with a properly configured virtual switch. So that's another factor you're going to want to take into account. With work groups, as long as your server is spec'd out properly, which it typically always will be because we take a look at that for you. You can have up to 300 agents assigned to various work groups on a server. So you've got a lot more capacity there with work groups. So those are a couple of the distinctions between hunt groups and work groups. The biggest one being the agent's ability to log in and log out in a work group and the ability to queue a call in a work group. Versus hunt groups being, much simpler, but they also give you the ability of kind of ring all, and they can even override. That's another important distinction is with a work group, if a user that's in a work group is on a call, the work group will not send them a second call until they get off that call. It's going to try to queue that call or give it to somebody else. With a hunt group, you can actually have that ring as a second call. So again, if you're dealing with that kind of must answer scenario, a hunt group might make a better choice because if that user's on a call and someone calls the hunt group, they'll be able to see that as a second call appearance on their phone, and they'll be able to jump over and grab that call. So hopefully that clears up a little bit of the distinction between hunt groups and work groups. And with that, I see we're approaching the top of the hour, and I've pretty much covered everything I wanted to cover. If you guys have any questions or things that you want to see, definitely let me know through the chat or questions. And if you're interested in any of the items we talked about today or anything else, obviously you can reach out to us. You can reach out to me directly, or you can reach out to our help desk over here. Feel free to do whatever works best for you.
Again, we appreciate everybody for joining us today. As always, Steve, thank you very much. This was definitely educational.
Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.